Now we're back under the bonnet. Want to make sure that this surface here is clean before we put our oil cooler back on. And also this oil drain back here, want to make sure that there's no old seal or anything in there. There might be a little bit of oil in there, that's fine. It'll actually make the O-ring slip in there a little bit easier. Grab your oil cooler, make sure that these seals haven't popped out of place and they're still sitting where they should. Also suggest just a little bit of oil on this O-ring here, just so it slides in nicely. And just press it into place. And it will sit there in on that. Now the 3 bolts. Once these have all just been nipped up, we will now tighten them up. I haven't looked up the torque spec, but a bit of common sense and just do them up nice and firm. Now I've grabbed this pipe. I've just dipped this end in the coolant, so it's actually a little bit wet at the moment, but it has some coolant on it just so it'll slide in easily. And we also have that little bolt that secures it underneath here. Just go in there and just gently slide that in. And line it up with this bolt under here. And that bolt locator there will make sure that that pipe stays in the oil cooler. Now we can pop this end back onto here. And we can tighten this clamp up. The next step will be putting the turbo and the exhaust manifold on. Before we do that, we just want to make sure that the cylinder head is clean. These threads are in good condition. So I'm going to spend a moment just to clean that up before we go to the next step. Now I'd strongly suggest a brand new gasket. Look, in a pinch you can use the old one, but you need to definitely clean them up. These are a couple of bucks. It's not worth the hassle of having to pull it off again because you've got a leaking gasket. So suggest a new one, but look, you could get away with an old one if you had to. So we'll sit the new gasket in place. Now before I put the turbo back on, there's a few things I want to check. The first thing is I want to make sure that this surface here is clean, ready to go up against that gasket. Also want to check that this surface here where that oil drain comes down and bolt to, that's clean and ready for that gasket. Also, just to note here, on the wastegate, it's fairly typical to see cracks. I don't know if you're going to see that one on the camera, but there is a little crack in here, sort of stretching out through there. That's not too bad. It's still quite serviceable. Perhaps next time we might replace the turbo, but at this stage with that crack, I wouldn't be too worried about it at all. So I'm just going to wire brush this a little bit just to clean them up. Now, although I can see some discoloration, nothing catches my fingernails there at all. So I'm fairly happy with how that sits. It's also important just to have a look. We'll take that band off. Look at this surface in around here. So I'm just going to give it a quick wipe over as well. We just want that nice and clean without anything sticking on there as well. Now, if you remember before, I put a little bit of tape over this, so we're just going to carefully pull that off. Again, if this gasket's not in good condition, I suggest you change it. It is a metal gasket, so it usually is okay to be reused. but just check the condition of it. With these tabs on this gasket, it really does sit nicely in place. So we can just sit it onto there. The next thing is this coolant hose. Now it bolts to the block with that 18mm banjo fitting. It has a washer on this side, it comes through, and it has a washer on the other side. Now because of the way the washer is designed with that rubber section, it will actually hold itself in place. So I'm just screwing it up. Remember, you obviously want the thread facing this way, which will end up being facing to the block. Now it's sitting there like that, and it's not going to go anywhere. That washer's not going to fall off. And let's put this turbo in place. Just squeeze it down. Line it up to the studs. And slide it on. Now I'm just going to run one of the nuts on just to hold it in place. Now all going well, that 18mm fitting should be in pretty well the right spot. And if you reach in from this side, you can reach around and hopefully get that started just with your fingers. Now, I feel like I've got a couple of threads started with that bolt. So remember, we had an 18mm socket on an extension bar. You can kind of fit it down between the pipes of the aircon compressor. Get it onto that fitting. I might be able to wind that on a bit more with this. It's a really difficult thing to see on camera, but you might just be able to see the socket spinning through there. We'll tighten that up with the ratchet. Done. Next, we just want to have a really good look at the band. I do suggest replacing them with a new one if you can. If yours is still serviceable, yep, use it again. Definitely make sure that the bolt runs in nicely. Otherwise, it's just going to be a really big pain to do up. And also just make sure that it's clean in all of these grooves before you start fitting it. Give it a good soak in some sort of a penetrating fluid. That will make your life easier. Now, how we want this orientated is something like that. So that clamp is sitting that way, so we can do that bolt up from the front. Make sure it's in place. So it'll just sit on there like that, and then we can tighten that up from there. My next step is I'm going to put the catalytic converter on. Make sure that this sealing ring here is in good condition. If it's not, replace it. Now I'm going to start from underneath and kind of put it up into position. I'm going to use these bolts here just to secure it roughly in place, and hopefully we can sneak it over that band easily. It's a little bit difficult because you've got to go from underneath and from the top at the same time. So if you've got a helper, now's the perfect time to use their help. Okay, so I've ducked underneath the car now, and we're looking up at the turbo from underneath. We want to secure this turbo feed line on, so there was the two bolts that secured it in place. Make sure that gasket is still sitting in the right spot. We'll run those bolts in. Now, they're pretty small bolts, so they don't need to be super tight. Just make sure while you're here that this pipe is in good condition, particularly where it goes down into the sump. Now, we had no leaks here at all, but if you do, you're going to need to get yourself another one of these tubes here. They're fairly cheap, and look, there's a lot of aftermarket ones now that are better than the original. But this plastic piece here is really prone to breaking, so that's usually what snaps. The metal frame and this piece up here is fine. With that now in place, I'm going to lift up the catalytic converter, try and get it as close as I can to being lined up, and we'll see if we can sit it on these bolts here just to hold it in place. Now we'll just make sure that the bolt is fitted onto this bracket. Make sure that the nut runs on that quite freely, and we'll lift up the catalytic converter and sit it in place. Now from underneath, you're not going to get it perfectly lined up, but we can get it on those bolts. And if we can get it sitting on the bolts in the approximate location, we'll be able to fix it up from the top. So it sits something like that. And let's have a look at from under the bonnet now.